Hello everyone and welcome back to Critique Clinic, the video series where we give our patrons and you advice on how you can improve your miniature painting.
We've got some really awesome miniatures to have a look at this week, so let's jump in and have a look.
Okay, first up we have got Matt M, who has painted Adrax Agatone for salamanders.
So this is probably one of my favourite salamander miniatures ever made, being honest. And Matt's done a great job on this. There's some really, really positive things to talk about on this miniature. There's a couple of things we're going to go over as well, just obviously to add value. But I really, really think that Matt's done a great job on it. So one of the first things that kind of instinctively jumps out at you, obviously you've got the green armor, you've got that, is the brazier or the flame on top of the backpack. And I've got to say, you've done a phenomenal job with the blending and
fantastic
the work.
Blending.
It is really, really, really great. I think you mentioned to us obviously that you knew a bit more contrast and stuff like that on there, but I think the flame is a really good example of that. We always say with like flames and things like that, looking at real life reference is really helpful. I think there's two things you can do to this to really just add a bit more to it. Towards the end of the flame, so where it's like licking away from the model or because of the wind and the direction of the wind on the miniature, I think that you could push that darker, so almost go to like a charred, almost like red black red kind of
like
tone.
A smoky sort of
smoky kind of color.
yeah.
Because the thing is like flames do go black towards their tips as they're away from the point of origin, which is the brightest point.
It's really hard with these sculpted flames. Actually, it can be quite difficult. I'm actually not.
It's really good. Like they've done really, really well. But I just think if you like because the yellow is so yellow, like you to add more contrast to it by going darker.
I think like black
tail.
tips on here, but I wouldn't go mad with it.
No.
I'm talking like literally just this area here that I would perhaps pull out and maybe like a tiny bit on here.
Yeah.
I think as well, if I was going to really nitpick, I would say maybe add a tiny bit of brighter yellow just on this sort of reverse side on the inside of the brazier, because if you think this is going to be the brightest point is actually where the flame is sort of emitting from, if that makes sense. But overall, like the blending is so smooth. I'm almost tempted to say to leave it.
It's really, really well done. So you should be super chuffed with that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing for me when we were looking over it is just, again, little things which add that level of depth or interest to the miniature. Now, a really good example of that is literally just on the leg here. You've got these lovely armor panels and all the stuff that you've done here, but then there's like a couple of rivets that aren't like painted.
I think potentially they've actually highlighted, just looking at the one on the other side, they've highlighted these with the sort of edge highlight
like
colour.
Paint. Yeah, no, I get that totally. That's fair. I mean, I said there's other things like, for example, this here, which this is a jack port. So this is where like a chapter surf will plug into the suit of power armor to like read a diagnostic. You know, are all the fans working? Like, you know, all the different little things. And then what a really good thing that you can do is obviously if you've got silver on the brush, it's right next to this chain here. Just paint it silver, just to add the value and interest of function to it again. But the other thing that's really nice to do, and this is something I love doing with these little details, is obviously the armor's green, the rect complement is red. You could literally paint that little recess there like a little light. You could put like a little red light in there. It would really focus the eye and draw the eye to that vibrant color and add interest and function to that part of the armor panel as well, which I think is quite nice. But yeah, it's just little things like that which will just take the model from being a really, really well painted model to add that level of function and interest at a much more smaller level on the miniature.
I think one sort of maybe bigger picture things I'd be conscious of with this as well is I think there's a bit of inconsistency in terms of overall saturation of colours. So, you know, the flames up here, which we've already spoken about, super saturated, really lovely, vibrant colours. But basing, quite dark, desaturated, and even the flames on the sort of waist of the armour here are quite pastely by comparison as well. And I'd even take that further. The edge highlighting, I think, is fairly sharp and clean across most areas of the actual armour itself, the green armour. But for me, again, this is opinionated, obviously. I think it's a little bit pastely in terms of the colour choice of said edge highlights. I would have gone for more of like a lime green personally, just to add a bit of vibrancy.
Like moot green and with a bit of maybe ice yellow into it as a secondary stage. And
potentially,
stuff like that.
I think less is more of the ice yellow personally, but I think, you know, like Warpstone Glow, moot green, that sort of colour combination from Citadel, I think works really, really nice. And then like pushing that up a bit brighter from there. But I think this is, you know, like I said, just a little bit desaturated for me. And it's quite stark as well because it's done sort of, you know, if we look at the sort of inner forearm here, it's a full bright, almost white edge across the whole thing. Again, I think if you'd have gone for, you know, we talk about contrast, there's a temptation to push things like all the way up to white, but it's not necessarily just about that. It's how dark and deep the shadows are, but also it's just sort of the color choice because it's not necessarily going for something brighter in terms of, you know, lightness, but it's also saturation and hue as well can also add that contrast.
Yeah, definitely. I said they were the main things that we saw, maybe, but we've got to give some special mentions to certain things on here, which I think you've done really well. And I really mean this, like the free hand on the loincloth, the little flames licking away there. I think they're really well done. Really nice little detail. Same with the text on the purity seal. Like, again, text is a really, really refined, tiny little thing to do. And I think that what you've done does read as text. It's not just straight lines. There's interest there. Like, I think you've done a really great job on those.
Yeah. But speaking to the contrast thing, which is something that they brought up in their comment of just trying to improve that, I would say, even like parchment, we've spoken about it on previous episodes.
Yeah.
It's something that's quite easy to overlook and just go, okay, I'm going to base coat it, put a wash on it, put the text on it. But then, like I said, by comparison, this looks flatter to me than other areas of the model. I mean, obviously there's an argument to be made for you might want it to look more weathered and aged, but it's just like the continuity of the style. If you're going to fully edge highlight all of the green armor, then I would be, edge highlighting the parchment just to make it stand out and give it that same level of contrast.
No, definitely.
It's just a continuity thing for me. I think equally, like even with the metallics, this is something that's quite easy to overlook as well because they're so shiny and light behaves with them nicely. I think the lighting of this photo is being quite flattering to some of the golds on the shoulder pad and the tilt shield. But I think using the weapon as an example, I think there probably is a little bit of a lack of contrast there as well.
Yeah, definitely.
It's something to do, just pick out a little sharp edge highlight on like the brass details, same on the silver. I think because light behaves with metallic paints quite, like I said, in quite a flattering way, there's a tendency to kind of avoid putting extra effort into them. But I would just be consistent with the way that you've done it across the whole miniature. I think it's something that seems like it won't do a lot, but it does actually add a lot of value all said and done.
I think that's one of the most important things about this model is that like that word consistency is really important. Again, just as a little touch point, just to chuck it in, you've got all these sharp edges on the armor that are highlighted like you've edged them again. But this Drake scale cloak that he has over his shoulder, each of these little scales is a hard material. It's like scaled armor from like the Drake. It would have sharp edges, just like you've done on the armor and other areas that are tiny little details. If you compare this audio sort of receptor on the side of his head, it's a small round disc shape with a sharp edge on it. That's not really any different from one of these scales that are just on the cloak, for example. So I probably would recommend making them still have the same behavioral characteristic in the highlighting as other areas of the model that are very similar. And that's just something that I think nods quite nicely to that continuity thing that we've said about the miniature. But overall, the model is fantastic. Really well done.
Really positive points to take from this. There's some fantastic paintwork. And I think you're definitely capable of all of the things that we've suggested. I think that's demonstrated in your brush control
definitely.
shown elsewhere on the model. It's just, I think that's more of a mindset and an attention shift than anything else.
No, definitely, yeah. And one last final thing, because I know it's something that actually you said, George, was actually the skin tone of this salamander. You've done really, really well as well. That sort of like ashen kind of grey black tone is just really, really well done. So well done on that.
Yeah, fantastic work. We'll look forward to seeing what you do in the future. Okay, next up we've got Swiss War Painter, who has painted some Eldar striking scorpions.
I really, really love this kit, and I think you've done a great job. There are some things on there which I think we just need to give some feedback on, and it's just things really to take into consideration when it comes to actually the execution of it.
But it's really neatly laid out, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
It's a great example of sort of neatly segmenting each individual area of a miniature, spending a lot of time there so that everything's quite like credible and it's quite apparent what every material and surface is supposed to be.
Yeah, I do agree hugely. And I said one of the things that I would definitely say on this is it kind of marries quite nicely to the previous miniature, which is just obviously it's just more of a consistency thing. I think there's some things with saturation which we want to talk about, and there's also some things with consistency, like that you've got some areas that do have a more definitive sharp edge highlight, so it's kind of like reading like that style is kind of like what you're trying to emulate. Maybe not fully on the miniature, maybe just on selective edges, which is still perfectly fine. But then again, you've got the hard edge there on the shuriken pistol where you can clearly see the edge highlight on it, and then there's like areas of the armor like the top of the knee and the top of the chest armor that like there is an edge there, but it's not as stark or as saturated as
even on the chainsword here, we've got some quite sharp edges along that plane there, but it's just a little bit lack of continuity, I think, in terms of the approach to highlighting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the things that this miniature does not have, it lacks a little bit at the minute. And I think that's something that's very easy to readdress and rebalance and just give that consistency and continuity between all the different parts.
Yeah, because obviously we're sympathetic to different painting styles. It's not like everything needs, heavy metal style edge highlights, but I think that whatever sort of path you're choosing to go down, it's just trying to sell the same surface materials by painting everything with the same, mindset shift in terms of how you're doing that. Like you said, even little things, just like overall contrast between the deep shadows here on the pistol and the brightest highlights. That's quite a big contrast gap. But elsewhere on the green armor, for example, the gap between the brightest highlight and the darkest shadow and the mid-tone is very, very subtle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things to me that immediately stood out with it. Another thing which I wanted to touch upon, and it's something that I know is an absolute stickler, is obviously just this seam here on the shoulder pad. And I know it is really tricky with this trim that's on the shoulder pads, obviously just it. But I think if you get some Tamiya sanding foam and literally just go over this and buff this with a high grit, maybe 800, 1,000, something like that, you won't get rid of detail. But what you'll do is you'll just soften this sort of like panel line, and it will just become a bit seamless. Or you can use George's favorite, which is Tamiya thin. That always works as well.
I think that's just something to bear in mind, like taking your time when you're putting miniatures together. Because, you can dry fit these parts before you glue them just to see how good that joint is and how big the seam gap is.
Yeah.
If it's not quite right, maybe you just need to shave a little bit of material off and then before you stick it together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think another thing that we were speaking about, I think the sort of skin tone is done really, really well. The very subtle volumetric kind of lighting on the forehead is done really nicely. I think you pointed out the hair as well. You said some bits about the hair.
Yeah, I think it's just, again, it's talking about the sort of consistency approach. Like the hair to me is super, super subtle in terms of how it's been shaded, and I'm not entirely certain it's been highlighted at all.
Yeah.
But it's quite a bright spot on the model. The face is sort of a focal point. You've got a fairly bright highlight here on the sort of mask, and the skin tone as well. There's quite a fair bit of contrast, particularly if you look at the recesses like under the eyes.
Yeah.
And then the bright spot on the forehead. Quite a big jump in contrast. But on the hair, it's quite flat to me, in my opinion. And like I said, I'm the sort of person who would like to spend a lot of extra attention on the face or the helmet of a model, because I do think that is the focal point. But to me, looking at that from sort of a wide view, the thing that actually grabs my eye the most is the pistol, just because of the massive contrast.
Yeah, it does hugely. And I think one of the things that as well that I always say about readability, like I wasn't too sure when we first looked at this model, I wasn't too sure if you decided to paint areas of the miniature in like a non-metallic, or if you were doing them more as, and I think as you pointed out, as wraith bone. So for example, like the sort of like grip on the chainsword and like the protective part that goes in front of the hand. I was like, have you painted that because you wanted that to be like non-metallic, or is it more a case of it being like wraith bone, like an ivory kind of color?
And I think the reason for that is just sort of because of the volumetric highlighting that's not really super. I mean, you've done a little bit of it on the armor panels, so fair enough. I'm not saying there's none of it there, but I think the way that's been highlighted and shaded across the volumes without really any edge highlights is a little bit inconsistent with how the rest of the miniature has been painted.
Correct.
Therefore, at a glance, we was sort of scratching our heads thinking if this was meant to be non-metallic
material
or not.
It is. Yeah, it's really hard to read what it is. But yeah, as I said, like there's just a little thing. Another point just to touch in there, I do actually really love the neutral sort of tone base. I think that's a really nice shout. I think it complements the model really nicely, because you've got a nice base there with some sort of desaturated tufts and stuff like that, and that sort of like ivory-ish kind of like sort of dulled sort of desert sandy sort of color looks quite nice as well. So I think you've done a really good job with the basing on the miniatures.
Overall color choice on the whole, I would actually say is really, really great. It's like a really, really nice miniature. It's quite pleasing to the eye.
Yeah.
Nice like contrast values. Everything stands out nicely in terms of complementing what it's surrounding. And from a wide angle view, it's like a really lovely silhouette as well, I think, in terms of like choices of the parts you've used and the way you've posed the model.
Yeah.
I think like I said, we've gone, fairly critical on some of the points there, but it's because I don't think it's your painting that actually needs the improvement there. It's the choices and the decisions you're making throughout the process. We're not sitting and saying, go and practice your brush control for 30 hours. It's just the decisions that you're making along the way. And I think that they'll make quite a big improvement to your painting overall.
Definitely.
Okay, last but by certainly no means least, we have Paul Nickel, who says, delighted to share my efforts on Typhus with you. The base is meh, and we'll be getting some further details added, but would love to have some critique and criticism of the man himself.
So, big fan of Typhus model. I think there's lots of interesting little details in it. I think you've done a great job, Paul, in painting him. There's a couple of little bits and bobs just to point out and just some stuff to go over. First thing that jumped out to me is I saw, obviously, you've used like copper on here as well. That's indicated by the fact there's a little bit of verdigris on those areas. So, if you have a look here at some of these rivets just on the top of the bottom of the scythe, I read this as a very similar material to this. So what was a little bit of a shame is that like you've started to do verdigris, but then there's like no verdigris on this. So like, again, this episode's got a lot of things to do with continuity. Like if you're painting a material on the surface of the object and you're aging it and weathering it, when the same material somewhere else is painted, but it doesn't have that that weathering or that sort of history or age to it. It kind of looks a bit out of place, if you follow me. So the chest hasn't got any, but then if you go up to the top of the scythe, I think you just put it up there, George. You got a little bit on that sort of power generator on the back of the blade.
Some on the sort of bells down here as well.
So it's just.
Would you say it's actually? This is an opinionated statement, but I'd actually say maybe it's a little bit too subtle as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what you can do is build that up, like start with a darker sort of like almost like Cantor blue, and do like the main bleed of that, and then focus the sort of brighter colors centrally within the thing you're trying to sort of add the verdigris to, because that shifting hue will just help push the contrast when you put that brighter color in there.
Really thinned down Sotek green is a favorite of mine.
Yeah, and then a bit of ice yellow or something into the Sotek just to punch it to like a Caribbean blue kind of scale 75 kind of color works really nicely. Or you could go down the route of like more like pastely green tones like that. I think there's a Games Workshop paint that's like an oxide paint or something like that.
No, like oxide.
Yeah, it's got like a more of a greeny hue to it. But again, that variance, and a good thing to do is just Google search like bronze statues and see the types of colors and tones that are on there for verdigris on copper, and that would give you a real good idea. But that round shape on the chest is a really nice detail to actually, because of gravity, just really frame some of the copper areas with some sort of like verdigris.
You've got some quite deep recesses as well, where I think it would sit quite nicely as well.
Yeah, definitely. You got that other little detail to the right, left of the chest as well. That other copper detail. You've also got the little breather ports on the front of Typhus's mask. You could do some verdigris on there. Again, lots of little areas that you can add a lot of interest to. So that's the first thing that came up.
In opposition to some of the consistency comments that you've made, I actually think that the red has perhaps been painted too consistently. And the reason I'll say that is we've got some fabric elements down here, but then up here we've got lights and lenses, and they're, by the looks of it, painted with the exact same reds and the exact same sort of recipe. And I'd argue even there's actually probably more contrast on some of the red fabric and cloth. But, you would expect a light to be really bright and vibrant and have a lot of, even if you don't want to go with glow effects and stuff like that, that's just fair enough. But just
the nature of the way it behaves and the way a lens
behaves.
But
just making it appear brighter by going more vibrant and more saturated with the colors. I'd work this all the way up to like orange. You could add some tiny little white dot like reflection lights. You could use like gloss varnish just on those, just to make them like shiny and appear a little bit different. It would just help them, stand out a little bit more, and they wouldn't get as lost, because I think the thing that I always say is the focal point of a miniature usually is the face or the helmet. In this case, that's absolutely fine. My eye's drawn to it because it's white and it's got the contrast of color to the rest of the armor. But those lenses are really getting lost for me, because I think they're just too dark.
Yep, I agree completely. Yeah, I think the other thing to bring continuity back into the mix, and this is another thing that I just noticed. If we have a look here, you got these rivets here that have clearly been picked out and have been painted. But then if we go over here on this arm, there's some here that aren't. Now look, they could just be painted, armor color, whatever the case may be. But I think if you're going to spend time and you're in the mindset of I'm doing all these rivets and painting these rivets like you have done here, I would just make sure that you're in rivet mode and you just
get them all.
So then that way it's sorted basically. But again, you've done a great job with the model. I love the sort of detritus and sort of like grime that's on the site. I think
very grimdark overall, this model, I would say, actually.
Yeah,
and that's quite a consistent mood across the piece, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. But I do want to say as well, give you a compliment on obviously the contrast that you've actually added to the miniature by doing like the little Nurglin and the sort of like weird like fleshy pipes and stuff in this like nice like pinky color as well. I think that really works nicely with the green and just really defines those specific details and parts of information on the model when you're looking at it. But overall, real fantastic miniature. Not too much to obviously to cover. I just think a little bit of work on the verdigris and a bit of consistency, and the red, and you should be all good.
Yeah, I completely agree. Great piece overall. Hopefully we've helped to steer you in the right direction for things you can improve. And thank you for submitting. Well, a huge thank you to all of our patrons for submitting their models for this episode. If you'd like to get your miniatures featured on a future episode of Critique Clinic, check the link in the description of this video. You'll find a link to our Patreon, as well as Critique Clinic. You'll also gain access to hundreds of high-quality PDF and video tutorials, which we update every single week. Otherwise, we hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Take care. See you very soon.